So Harold was a native of Pennsylvania, and he graduated from the University of Illinois in the 1920s. For a brief period of time, he was actually a newspaper reporter in South America, but then eventually ended up settling in the Youngstown area. He attended Yale for about 3 years, and he was awarded the Best Director Prize in 1933. Harold and his friend Paul Tretchler, he was a former theater professor at Antioch, and they actually attended Yale together. It's believed that Harold decided to make Yellow Springs his home after he learned his friend had accepted a position here. Igo wrote a number of plays that were performed at the Yellow Springs Opera House during its heyday. And then during the 1940s, he wrote this series of ghost stories that were published in the Yellow Springs News. The stories were actually based on real events and featured real people, but Igo wrote the stories as they were told by local residents. These stories were published in 2001 by the Yellow Springs Historical Society as the Haunted Houses, Spooky Tales of Yellow Springs. So today we're actually going to share 4 of these spooky tales with you and then delve into the facts behind the actual stories. When you're listening to the stories today, please keep in mind that these were written in the 1940s. So they contain language, terminology, or maybe imagery that reflect the cultural standards of the time. So these terms, words, and imagery that are included today, it's not as an endorsement of these standards, but to tell the stories as they were originally written. So let's get started. The first story is called number 6, The House of the Fiery Ferns, and it was published in the Yellow Springs News on March 11th, 1943. And this is how the story was written according to Igo. Everybody liked Denman Duncan, even though he had the drug habit. 30 years ago, he was the son of an Antioch professor, and he often took his father's classes in plant physiology. Between times, he read a lot of books, he studied nature in the Glen, and even did odd jobs for neighbors, such as painting and paper hanging. He lived in one of the little cottages, which used to stand near the site of the Bryan High School, the last remnant of the old Neff Hotel in Yellow Springs. And the editor actually notes that it's actually the Yellow Springs house. In that row of cottages lived Lewis Haynes and his young wife. Haynes worked at Carr's nursery. Now see how fate brought these two men together. Mrs. Haynes was considered by some as more of a child than a grown woman. She had always looked up to her husband with a certain awe, such as a child regards its father. But when Denman Duncan became a neighbor of the Haynes, she transferred those feelings from the greenhouse laborer to the educated naturalist. One night, she told her husband excitedly, "Oh, what do you think? Mr. Duncan has found 40 different ferns in the Glen." "That fellow wouldn't know a fern if he saw one," growled Haynes. "Oh, but he has read all about them in books," said Mrs. Haynes, apparently much impressed. "Bookman," sneered Haynes. "I guess I work with ferns, don't I? Skunk cabbages is all he's ever found." And so on. Another night, his wife had more news of Duncan. "I can't wait to tell you," she said. "Mr. Duncan found a walking fern." "A what?" asked Haynes. "A real walking fern." But Lou Haynes didn't want to hear more. He gulped down his coffee and went over to see Duncan. Denman was polishing up a walnut stool John Birch had lent him. "My wife says you..." And Lou stopped. He realized Duncan knew more about ferns than he did, had more book learning, so he twisted his remarks. "Says you were showing her that stool today." "Why, yes," said Duncan innocently. "She stopped in and I showed it to her." Snapped Haynes and disappeared. Duncan considered this. Why, that fellow acted like he was jealous. That would never do. He decided to take the stool back first thing in the morning, and he did. But that night, either from a desire to make her husband jealous or to dramatize her own lack of mature feminine attraction, the wife started the fern discussion again at the table. "Oh, Lou," she began, "I must tell you the most wonderful thing. Mr. Duncan has found a new fern, one that shines at night like a fire." "Foxfire," growled Haynes. "No, a real fern, like fire." Haynes got up from the table and went out again, but this time he had a hatchet in his hand. It was only a few steps on the back porch to Duncan's door. He opened it softly. Duncan was sitting by a lamp reading. Like an Indian with a tomahawk, he sunk the hatchet into Duncan's skull. I heard at least 5 different versions of the Haynes Duncan killing, but this version of the story intrigued me the most. The fellow who told it said there had been a legend that on a dark night, if you stood in the culvert of the Springfield Road and looked down the creek, you might see an occasional gleam of light from Duncan's phosphorescent ferns. I certainly can't vouch for this, but one of these dark nights, I'm going to go look. All right, so that's the story according to Igo. So let's actually look into all of the actual details of the story. So Denman Duncan's neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Haynes, obviously there was lots of discussions at the dinner table that were upsetting, and there are multiple versions of the story. So who are the actual key players? So according to Igo, we have Denman Duncan and then Lewis Haynes and his wife. And in reality, they're the same, they're just spelled differently. So we have Denman Duncan, Lewis Haynes, and Maud Haynes. We actually have his wife's name in reality. So what do we actually know about these people? Denman Duncan was born in Indiana around 1867, and he was the son of Dr. Amos Duncan, who was the first chair of physiology department at Antioch College. Duncan himself attended Antioch from 1874 to 1880. And he spent most of his life living in Yellow Springs, and he was a painter and wallpaper hanger by trade. The 1910 census does confirm this by listing his occupation as a decorator. Now, newspaper articles indicate that he was also part of a local orchestra that was put together at Antioch. These newspapers published after Duncan's death, as well as Igo's story, they all allude that Duncan was a very well-educated man, but he did have a drug problem. One article actually indicates that he was addicted to morphine and cocaine, and that was because of his addiction that he lost his opportunities to excel in science, much as his father did. An article in the Xenia Gazette indicates that he spent some time at the Dayton State Hospital in 1914, but since that time, he had remained drug-free. Now, if we look at his estate inventory, this gives us a little more information about him. It does confirm that he did die with very little property. However, he had a large number of books, and if you can kind of see if you look on this that he had several books listed. So it does again suggest that he was a fairly well-educated man, at least when it comes to book learning. So what do we actually know about the murder? Now, Denman Duncan lived in one of the cottages on the property that was once known as the Yellow Springs house, which is what they said in the story. And it's behind the current, today, what would be known as the Bryan Center, not the Neff house, though, as indicated by Igo. Lewis and Maud Haynes were neighbors, and they lived in the adjoining cottage. The couple were married on August 17th, 1909. Lewis was 46 years old and Maud was 25. And jealousy was a big problem for Lewis from the beginning. Whether Lewis actually worked at the Carr nursery, though, it's unknown. We don't have a clear indication. The 1910 federal census listed that Lewis was a laborer and that he had worked odd jobs, so it's a possibility he did work there. And at this time, Lewis and his wife were living in Osborn. So maybe he came to Yellow Springs to work for the nursery. Again, that's kind of a piece of that history that you lose with having only, with the census being 10 years apart, you can kind of lose people every so often. So what actually happened? So at 7 a.m. on September 14th, 1915, Albert Harner, a 4-year-old neighbor, found Duncan's body. Duncan was lying face down in a pool of his own blood from a wound on his head. His pockets had been rifled through, making it look like a robbery was likely the motive. Investigators found a hatchet inside a moss-covered spring pond that was located behind the cottage. And it had Duncan's name actually carved into it. This was clearly the murder weapon. The newspapers report that there was blood on the doorknob to the back door of the house and blood and other marks on the side of the door. Blood was also found in the Haynes bedroom, which obviously led the authorities to look at Lewis Haynes as the murderer. Lewis was actually tried for the murder of Duncan. And during his trial, Maud, his wife, testified that on the evening of the murder, she teasingly told her husband that she and Duncan had been intimate. But in reality, that there had never been any kind of improper relationship between her and Duncan. She just wanted to tease her husband and make him jealous. Obviously, that was a terrible idea for many reasons. Eventually, Lewis Haynes confessed that after his wife told him that she had been intimate with Duncan, he had had enough. And he left their bed and went to Duncan's cottage. And on the way in the door, he saw the hatchet leaning against the wall and he picked it up. Duncan was sitting in the chair. He put down the book he was reading, which was Les Miserables. And Haynes raised the hatchet and killed him with one blow. After Haynes disposed of the hatchet, he returned to his bed and he told Maud that if she told anybody, he would kill her too. Lewis was actually found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in the state penitentiary. In November 1913, Maud filed for divorce, and the divorce was granted the following year. We actually found Lewis on the 1920 census as an inmate at the Ohio Penitentiary. I'm not really sure what happened to Maud, but we wonder if she ever felt guilty for telling her husband the lie that actually cost Duncan his life. And whether Duncan ever really discussed a new fern with Maud, we may never know. If you get a chance though, maybe you should wander at night and take a look to see if you can see Duncan's fire fern glowing down by the Yellow Spring Creek. I'd be interested in learning. So that's story number one. Let's take a look at another one. So this one, the second story, is called Number 13, The Hamlet's Ghost in Osborn. This was an article that was published on April 19th, 1943 in the Yellow Springs News. And this is how the story goes according to IGO. Shades of Shakespeare's immortal Hamlet, as well as the Greek Furies, arise as one considers Osborn's most famous ghost story, that of the Folk murder. The fall of 1866 was surely one to remember. The Civil War was just leaving in its wake the inevitable exhaustion of people and land. George Folk was a hardworking farmer. He had to be to raise a family of 7 sons and 3 daughters. But the gloomy, bankrupt days of the war's end struck him as it hit thousands of other farmers. And that year, nature helped to ruin him. His crops were burnt by drought, his cattle died in the field, and one night, George Folk drank a bottle of laudanum and ended it all. The widow Folk struggled bravely, but it looked at the time that even with her son's help, the farm would go under the hammer. Then one day, there came along the road a traveler, a young man by the name of Billy Fletcher. "Just call me Billy," he said. Nobody knew where he came from unless it was from heaven. He jumped in and helped out the folks. There was nothing he couldn't do. He was a dynamo of energy. He could even beat the bankers at their own game. And at the end of the year, when it was clear that they were out of debt, The whole family hailed him as a savior. Then one morning, the children were thunderstruck to hear him calmly announce he was going to marry their mother. Their mother was at least 30 years older than Billy. The very thought of this made their ears burn with shame. They pleaded with their mother, but she wouldn't listen. She declared she was in love with the young man, and in no time, the pair were married. Then the son held secret meetings in the barn to decide what course to follow. But it was shrewd Will Pettigrew, the son-in-law, who came up with a bold idea. The ghost of George Folk must walk again to avenge the marriage. Hence began the strange duel of a spook and a young man's courage. Several times Billy wakened in the middle of the night to see a dim form standing by his bed. "I am George Folk," he said in low tones. "Why are you in my wife's bed?" If Fletcher found himself alone in the barn, he would at once hear whispers about him, and the mow over his head, and the grain bins, even under the floor. "I am George Folk," they said. "You shall die as I have died, unless you go away and leave my lawful wife to mourn me." The young Billy Fletcher was no coward. He went right on and did nothing. Or perhaps he loved the widow so much that his love conquered his fears. One night, he awakened to see a great light in the barn. He thought the new hay had caught fire. Quickly jumping into his clothes, he ran to open the door. He was met with a bullet through the chest. The sheriff didn't have to go far to find his man. Will Pettigrew walked all the way to Xenia to give himself up. His story was that Billy shot first, so I had to kill him. Deputy examined Billy Fletcher's gun, but found it had not been fired. That would have been bad for Pettigrew if it had been made public. But so deep was the sympathy for everyone, for the Folk boys over their family's wrong, that the officials just winked. Old timers still talk about the trial in Xenia. It drew the largest crowd ever attended a murder case in Greene County. Will Pettigrew repeated his story, and there wasn't one man who dared stand up and dispute it. When the foreman of the jury brought the verdict not guilty, there was a mighty cheer. Will Pettigrew was lifted to shoulders and with a great parade following, escorted back to the Folk farm. And to cap legal justice, a committee came forward with a gift of a new suit of clothes and a barrel of flour. The ghost of Hamlet's father had been vindicated in Osborn. Okay, so that we've heard Igo's story, what actually happened. This one is actually much more interesting than Igo's story, ultimately. So according to Igo, the key players were George Folk, the widow Folk, Billy Fletcher, and Will Pettigrew. And in order to determine what really happened, we looked at census, cemetery, deed, court, will, and estate records. And like I said, and we hadn't imagined that the reality of the story was so much more interesting. The story actually spans several generations and includes families such as the Folks, Fricks, Landys, and Route songs. But that's going to have to be a story for another time because it's a very long one, a little convoluted. So there was a George Folk that was living in Bath Township during this period of time, but according to his death record, he died in 1875 from drinking bad whiskey, and George Folk in the story actually died in 1866, so there's something not right there. Also, based on the records, there was no connection between a George Folk and a Billy Fletcher. However, the 1850 census provided us our link. It indicates that there was a Jacob and Elizabeth Folk living in Bath Township, along with their 5 children. We learned that Elizabeth Frick and Jacob Folk were married in Greene County on December 2nd, 1819. And the records indicate that Jacob and Elizabeth had 4 daughters, which differs from Igo's story. But we can only trace 4 sons, plus another man named Henry Wilson, which is another difference. So we followed Jacob Folk and found that he was born in Pennsylvania in January of 1798. And Jacob died on September 24th, 1866, and was buried in the Folk Cemetery in Byron, Bath Township. So this date is before Ohio began requiring birth and death records to be recorded. So unfortunately, we don't have the record of his death. And there wasn't an obituary or anything published either. And so it doesn't provide any kind of cause of death. But his tombstone lists his wife, Elizabeth, who was born on May 12th, 1799, but she does not have a date of death listed. So we have to find out whether Jacob and Elizabeth were connected to Billy Fletcher. And sure enough, listed under marriage licenses and the Xenia Torchlight, on May 6, 1868, the names of William Fletcher and Elizabeth Folk were listed. So it's very possible that William Fletcher was the one and the same Billy Fletcher. And so we have our connection. As mentioned, it appears that they were at least 23 years age difference between Billy and Elizabeth. So what Igo said in the story wasn't far off. So now that we know the story actually contains a Jacob, not a George, and Elizabeth Folk, along with William Billy Fletcher. So now let's look at the newspaper articles on the actual murder. So the headlines on the Xenia Torchlight for July 23rd, 1868 read, "Horrible domestic tragedy, a man murdered by his stepson." So according to this article, it was between 9 and 10 o'clock on July 23rd, 1868. A man by the name of William Fletcher, residing 1 mile north of Byron in Greene County, was shot by his stepson, Henry Wilson. The newspaper continues, "It appears Fletcher had married Wilson's mother several months ago, and that her sons, to the number of 4 or 5, had been greatly outraged. One might surmise that the sons believed that this young man, about their age, had married their mother just to get his hands on their property." The newspaper article also states that Wilson had vowed vengeance against his stepfather on several occasions. He had sworn to take his life, burn his barn, or otherwise just harm him. Fletcher's horses had been turned loose, his corn had been stolen, and this all led to charges of his stepson, Henry Wilson. Also based on this article, Henry Wilson did not have any goodwill towards Billy Fletcher. And in an article published in April of 1869, they said that there was an irreconcilable animosity seems to have existed between Henry Wilson and his mother since her marriage to Billy Fletcher. And it states that Henry had made frequent threats of violence against both his mother and Fletcher, even stating that on their wedding day, Wilson said he would kill Fletcher. So obviously there was a lot going against Henry Wilson. Now, there were other articles that list a Samuel Pettigrew. The state's chief witness testified that a short time before the murder, Wilson had stated he would kill both Fletcher and his mother, saying, "By God, I will kill them both and cut their blankety blank hearts out and hitch a horse to the heels and drag them out in the woods and let the hogs eat them." So obviously he had no love lost. Now, you might have noticed that we hear the name Pettigrew. Now, in Igo's story, he mentions a Will Pettigrew, but it was actually Samuel Pettigrew who was part of this story. And he was not the killer. He was actually the state's witness. But they were right that it was his son-in-law that killed him. So none of the Folk daughters actually married the Pettigrew. So there's not a connection that way. He was just the neighbor. The article goes on to state that the farm in which Wilson imagined Fletcher's marriage was designed to deprive the heirs of his mother's death, once she died. And that was basically the chief bone of contention between them, that he was worried that Fletcher was trying to get their property. Now, Samuel Pettigrew, the key witness, heard the shots from his nearby farm and started to Fletcher's along with a Mr. George Roberts. When they neared the barn, they heard someone talking to Wilson, and Wilson announced that he had killed him, in quotations, referring to Fletcher. Once Pettigrew made his presence known, Wilson said that Fletcher had shot him first, so he fired in self-defense. Once Fletcher's body was found, there was a revolver found with the body, but it was fully loaded and capped, along with a shotgun, and both barrels were still fully loaded and capped. So that's so much for Wilson's story of self-defense, because he never even never even fired his pistol. Now, this one is also interesting because we have actually a plat map of the murder scene. And so obviously at that time, there were obviously no digital cameras. So they called in Washington Galloway, the county surveyor, to create a plat map of the murder scene. So this also provides a little more detail about where the murder actually took place. According to Igo, he was shot coming out of his house. But if you actually look at this map, you can see he was actually found very close to the barn. So if you're looking at the map in the orchard, I think you can see here, he was found here. So another discrepancy. And so it clearly maps the scene of the crime and provides a better illustration of the actual events of the murder. Now, Henry Wilson, he was 50 years old at the time of the murder, and he was actually found guilty of first-degree murder on April 12th, 1869. However, his attorney called for a new trial, claiming there was an incompetent juror. Actually, at that time, there was a requirement to be a juror. You had to be a landowner, and one of the jurors was not. So the judge did grant a new trial. The jury was selected, and the case was retried. On November 30th, 1869, Henry Wilson was actually found not guilty of murder. According to an article in the December 8th, 1869 issue of the Xenia Torchlight, the verdict of not guilty meant self-defense or justifiable homicide. The second jury finds that the prisoner was in imminent deadly peril of his life without an avenue of escape, and that it was impossible for him to shun a deadly struggle, and which it became his duty to take the life of his antagonist. In Igo's story, this is where the verdict, everyone screamed and cheered, and Wilson was hoisted and carried back to the farm. However, the newspaper clearly indicates that the courtroom was completely silent when the verdict was read. After the trial, Wilson disappears from the records. There's a newspaper article from June 1870 that indicates that he was in trouble again, this time for stealing a trunk from a passenger train. However, we've not been able to find any kind of court records to support the claim, and Wilson and his family just seemed to vanish. So we have no idea what actually happened to Henry Wilson after that event. All right, let's look at story number 3. Now this story is titled Number 15, The Ghost of Frogtown, and it was published on May 20th, 1943. Now this story goes, according to Igo, in the days you just walked out Dayton Street until you struck the mud, and then you were in Frogtown. Of course, Frogtown was a legal part of Yellow Springs, but not everything that went on there was legal. Many of the more adventuresome spirits took up their abode there. Yes, Frogtown had a flavor all its own. A lady known as Lou, i.e. Lou Keys, lived in a little house next to the present Fullick residence. She was a vivacious, slightly dusky woman with a yen for a good time and what amounted to the same thing, or, what amounted to the same thing. A good-looking man came along, George Kugler, who had been back from the war, for years now, But every Memorial Day and every 4th of July, he put on his uniform. He wasn't bad looking either, and Lou had eyes for soldiers. Give him 3 glasses of beer and George could put you to sleep with his rich baritone. Lots of folks told of going to Lou's and hearing George sing his pet song, "Oh, my pretty quadroon." But there were other eyes on Lou. Andy Hunster ran an ice cream parlor across from the old post office after he had lost a leg having it frozen. No association between the leg and the ice cream. Andy, for his handicaps, fancied he was a ladies' man. And what was worse, that Lou was interested in him. He even boasted that he was going to marry her before George Kugler appeared. One frosty morning, they found Kugler sprawled on the lawn outside Lou's place, and Lou inside on the floor. Both had their skulls split open, as if they had been struck with an Indian's tomahawk. Suspicion centered on Andy and Marshal Dan Thunderberg, who had only one good arm, and took him off to Xenia. Twice Andy stood trial, but he was acquitted for lack of evidence against him. A few nights after his acquittal, a Yellow Springs barber was startled when Andy burst in with a wild story. He said, as he was walking out to Frogtown, he ran smack into Lou and George. Oh yes, it was them all right. They were walking arm in arm, and George was singing his song about the pretty quadroon, and Lou was looking up into his eyes, and they walked right through him. It was a foggy night, and maybe Andy had had a few drinks under his belt. And anyway, hadn't he just been acquitted of murder, and perhaps nerves were wee jumpy? Adding it all up, the men at the barbershop figured Andy's imagination had played a trick on him. They persuaded him to go home and forget it. Andy went home, but he didn't forget it. All right, so that's the story according to IGO. So what do we actually know here? Now, there's actually not a whole lot known about Frogtown. It was known to be a swampy part of town. Information from the Greene County room at the Xenia Community Library indicates that the name may have originated from Irish immigrants who settled there because it reminded them of a swampy area in Ireland that was called Frogtown. Other stories indicate that it got its name because of a deep open ditch that ran parallel to the Dayton Pike on the north that was inhabited by so many frogs that their croaking could be heard all over the neighborhood. Early road records clearly show Frogtown in the area where Antioch Midwest is located today. The information from the Greene County room indicates that Frogtown extended from Gravel Pit Road, what we know today as Wright Street, west to East Enon Road. So actually the photograph we have here, or this map we have here, is of what we would consider Frogtown. You can actually see it. They have it listed right here. This is Frogtown. So most of the houses were located on either side of Dayton Street, and a few were on Wright Street and Union Street. The area included 15 or 10 or 12 to 15 families, and their last names were like Abby, Finn, DeWine, Shaw, Quinn, Perry, Kenny, which seemed pretty Irish. So there was a wooden bridge that also spanned the ditch at the intersection of Wright Street and Dayton Street. And this was the place where the men of the neighborhood would spend their evenings reminiscing tales of the old country and discussing the present day issues and problems. Fiddle music could be heard playing, which always attracted a crowd. So Frogtown was known for the occasional person who had just visited the saloon over on High Street who just so happened to be in the mood for an argument. So Frogtown seemed to be the place where people like to go to find an argument. Many of the men worked at either Go's powder mill, so either Go's station, and the children of the families were often seen selling vegetables out of wagons throughout the village. So that's a little bit about Frogtown itself. But what do we actually know about the murder? So this is a modern day, obviously, photograph of the potential location described by Igo in his story. This particular house, as with obviously many homes, was built long after the murder would have taken place. But this is potentially the location of the murder scene there in what we would consider now Frogtown. Now, Igo indicates that George quite frequently sang a song called My Pretty Quadroon to Lou, and indicates that was a Civil War campfire song that lived on to the 20th century in vaudeville. So just for fun, we wanted to let you guys hear it. So I'm going to go ahead and play it for you. I see her dear eyes shining here. All right. We thought that was fun to give you guys that little bit. Okay, so what happened? Newspapers account that the murder was, or the murder indicate that the newspapers accounts indicate that George Kugler was courting Lou Keys, who did live in Frogtown. The morning after the murder, their bodies were both found outside of Lou Keys' home. Their skulls had been shattered, and an ice pick was found in one of Miss Keys' eyes. The Cincinnati Enquirer article claims that the weapon was a hammer that Lou Keys used to break up coal. This was the first murder in Yellow Springs since 1863, so it actually got a lot of attention. An investigation ensued for weeks and months following the murder. On December 15th, 1892, there is another newspaper article that kind of gives a little more information. It was a special. So Springfield, Ohio, December 14th. Miss Huntsinger, or Huntzer, who keeps a restaurant where George Kugler and Lou Roberts, alias Keys, the victim of the double tragedy at Yellow Springs, were last seen alive, claims that while the pair were eating oysters in his place, a suspicious character watched them by peeping through the window. He thought nothing of it at the time and can give no description of the fellow except that it was a stranger. A witness testified that he had heard George and Lou walking by his house, but he had heard a third voice that he recognized, and that voice belonged to Annie Huntzer. So Andy was the son of Edward, who was the restaurant owner where Kugler and Keys were last seen before their murder. So whether or not he was actually a stranger, that leads us to believe probably not. So let's tell you guys a little bit about each of these players. So Lou Keys, aka Lou Roberts, she was an African-American woman about 35 years old. According to the 1880 census, there was a Lou Roberts incarcerated in Xenia jail awaiting trial for grand larceny. Is this our Lou Roberts, Lou Keys? Potentially. And December 14th, 1892, in the Xenia Gazette includes an article which describes Lou Keys as having an unsavory reputation. Now, George Kugler, he was about 52 years old and a widower with 3 children. He was a Civil War veteran serving in the 154th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and he drew an $8 a month pension. He was actually supposed to draw his pension the day of the murder, but it hadn't arrived. So that's kind of interesting to keep in mind too. So his pockets were rifled through along with the trunk in his house. So it's possible that somebody knew he was supposed to be getting paid and maybe trying to rob them. Miss Keyes and George Kugler were last seen alive around 11 p.m. on the night of the murder, and they were eating oysters as stated, and also were said to be intoxicated. Now, Handy Hunser, he was about 40 years old, and he was the son of Edward and Margaret, who owned and operated the hotel restaurant on Corey Street in Yellow Springs. According to the 1880 census, he was listed as maimed, crippled, bedridden, or otherwise disabled. And he was also listed as mulatto, which is a historic term that we don't use today, but it means biracial for those who aren't aware. The 1900 census shows Andy still living in Yellow Springs with his family, but by the 1910 census, he's listed as an inmate in the Clark County Infirmary. So perhaps Harold Igoe was accurate in his story when he says that it was Andy who had feelings for Lou. Maybe it was this unrequited love that drove him to murder George and Lou, but we don't know. He was eventually tried for the murder, but he was acquitted for lack of evidence. One can only imagine what his life must have been like if indeed he had killed a woman he loved. As I mentioned previously, the 1910 federal census places him in the Clark County Infirmary. So did the ghost of Frogtown actually haunt Andy the rest of his life? It's quite possible. All right, on to our last story. This one is kind of interesting because it takes part partially here in Greene County, but a good chunk of it actually happens outside of our county, but it's still a good one and we wanted to share it. So this one is called Number 20, The Senator Walks at Midnight. And it was written on June 17th, 1943. And this story by Igoe reads, "He's a wonder," said Professor Tufts. "I don't understand how anyone can stay up until midnight and be fresh as a daisy the next morning." It was Antioch, 1862. And the professor was speaking of Arthur Brown, aged 19, the youngest student to date to graduate. Brown was a thin, rather homely fellow, but he had eyes that burned into you. He had a habit of taking walks at midnight. Folks saw him walking along, making plans, for he was ambitious. He astounded his fellow classmates on graduation day by telling them that he would be a U.S. Senator in less than 10 years. Well, maybe it took longer, but he made it. Somewhere around the turn of the century, Arthur Brown appeared in Yellow Springs one day with a beautiful woman he introduced as his wife. He arranged for his meals with Miss Lydia Dennison, who conducted a select boarding house, and he and Miss Brown roamed across to the Birches. He told people that he was combining pleasure with business. He had come here to help settle a famous Mercer estate on the road to Dayton, and that he was one of the heirs. He, in fact, had promised Mrs. Brown that he might buy up the other heirs and they would make this old stone house their future home. Even that night, when most of Yellow Springs was asleep, the town marshal met Arthur Brown walking at midnight, walking and planning. Then the Browns returned to Washington. In a very short while, the papers were filled with news of a sensational tragedy. Arthur Brown had been shot to death by the supposed Mrs. Brown, whose real name was Catherine Bradley. Arthur had a family of his own in Utah, as it was discovered. Miss Bradley had learned these facts. Also, that Brown had been deceiving her about the Mercer estate and her future home. Suddenly, her dream world collapsed, and when Arthur refused to divorce his wife, she fired a bullet through his heart. Miss Bradley was acquitted and in time was forgotten, or almost. About 10 years after the shooting, a farmer by the name of Elmer Moore, who lived near Byron in Yellow Springs, one Saturday night, it was near midnight when he started home. He saw a man and woman walking out the Dayton Road. He stopped and picked them up. The man said he was taking his wife to see the Mercer estate, as she was considering buying it. Moore thought it rather strange for a couple to visit a house at midnight, but he drove on. When he came opposite the stone house, he said, "Whoa." His horses stopped. "Well, here's the place." He turned to the rear seat, but there was nobody there. The man and woman had disappeared. From Moore's description, folks said the couple were Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Brown. So that's Igo's story. And in order to determine what really happened, we decided to look at the census records, deeds, wills, estate records, and again, newspaper articles. The facts based on sources confirm that Arthur Brown did visit Yellow Springs in 1902. We'll talk a little more about that shortly, but so we do know at least that. The house that Igo refers to as the Mercer Estate was on the auction block a few years ago. So we learned a bit of its history when that happened. And according to the deed and estate records, this house had been in the Wolf family since it was built in the early 1800s up until a few years ago. So this piece of Igo's story doesn't really mesh with the facts. Also, there's no Mercer family in the Byron area at the time, according to census records. So it's possible that maybe somebody lived there and they just weren't accounted for, but likely this was a mistake. So according to Igo, the main characters are Senator Arthur Brown, Mrs. Brown, or AKA Catherine Bradley, and Elmer Moore. But in reality, this is a much more complicated tale. It's actually Senator Brown, his first wife, Lydia Kuhn, his second wife, Isabel Cameron, and two mistresses, Anne Bradley and Anne Adams. I always say her last name wrong, Kiskadin. So obviously this is a much more involved story than what Igo was told. So who are these people and how do they fit into the story? So here's what we know. Arthur Brown was born on March 8th, 1843 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And a fun fact, his sister was actually Olympia Brown, who also graduated from Antioch University or Antioch College and was the first woman to become an ordained minister in the Unitarian Church. So that's just a little fun fact. So back to Arthur. Arthur graduated from Antioch College in 1862, and he would have been 19 as the story claims. He married Lydia Kuhn on January 25th, 1872, and they had a daughter, Alice, who was born on February 22nd, 1874. While still married to Lydia, Arthur met and fell in love, I use that term loosely, with Isabel Cameron. Newspaper articles indicate that Lydia found out about the affair and tried to kill Arthur, but missed. After that, Arthur divorced Lydia, moved to Utah, and married Isabel in 1879. And on June 21st, 1882, Isabel and Arthur had a son, Max. So hopefully you're still with me. So while Brown was living in Utah and working on his political career, he did become a senator, he met Anne Bradley in 1892, and they developed a close friendship, as they stated. But I believe we are noticing a pattern here, right? According to Igo, Bradley was not aware of that the senator was married, but in reality, she was very much aware of the situation. Some newspaper articles indicate that it was Isabel who actually introduced the two. So in 1902, Arthur did come to Yellow Springs with Anne, and he did introduce her as Mrs. Brown. Isabel heard about this whole encounter through the local newspapers and was furious. Seriously, how he didn't think Isabel would find out coming to a town and always there being gossip in newspapers back then is beyond me, but he did. Anyway, Arthur eventually filed for divorce. And in retaliation, Isabel had Arthur and Anne arrested for adultery. And after many arguments and negotiations, Arthur told Isabel that he would end his relationship with Anne. Meanwhile, Anne insisted that two of her children, were Arthur's, but Arthur continually denied this claim. So Anne actually had 2 children from a previous marriage and then 2 more after she had been seeing Arthur. But Arthur claimed that their relationship had been on again and off again, so who knows if they're actually his. And it was during this period that Arthur purchased a gun for Anne to protect her in the event that Isabel might come after her, because obviously he had already had that happen once where his wife tried to kill him. So I guess this was another pattern that we're noticing. Unfortunately, though, Isabel became sick and she actually died of cancer on August 22nd, 1905, which for Anne and Arthur seemed to open a door for them to finally be together. But was that really what Arthur wanted? I think we all are aware that that's not what Arthur wanted. So after Isabel's death, true to form, Arthur would not commit to a wedding date and kept postponing any plans. And then Anne learned that Arthur was intent on marrying someone else, and that would be Annie Adams Kissenden, who was the mother of America's most prominent actress at the time, Maude Adams. And Anne Bradley had caught wind of this, and in December 1906, she actually followed Arthur to Washington, D.C. when he was coming here to argue a case before the Supreme Court. So frantically, Anne searched for the hotel where Arthur was going to be staying. And after 3 attempts, she found the hotel and checked in. And by chance, her room was only 4 doors down from Arthur's. Anne entered his room in a fury and demanded that he marry her. While inside Arthur's room, she observed several letters that were written between him and Annie, and she was irate. Arthur decided he was not going to deal with it and turned to walk away. And that's when Anne drew the gun that he had bought her and shot him in the abdomen. Hearing the gunshot, the hotel manager ran up to the room and asked if she was the Senator Brown's wife. And Anne responded, "No, but I am the mother of his children." Now, a Washington Herald newspaper reported that when asked if she felt justified in her actions, she replied, "I certainly do, and I do not feel that I have anything to regret. And I think I will have the support of my friends in the West in what I have done." And she went on to say that he is not a Mormon polygamist, but he's a Gentile polygamist. He is a father of my 2 children. He has ruined my life. Many people across the country actually felt very sorry for Anne. She told everyone after the shooting that she only had $1 to her name, and she ended up only with 75 cents after she paid the bellboy to bring her her bags. Local DC restaurants donated meals to her while she was behind bars, and family, friends, and strangers sent her money to help pay for her legal expenses. Ultimately, Anne was actually acquitted based on temporary insanity. But the story doesn't end here. 9 years after Arthur was shot in DC, there was even more tragedy for Anne Bradley. In April 1915, Matthew Bradley, Anne's son from her marriage, shot and killed his half-brother, Arthur Brown Jr. According to an article in the Washington Herald, Matthew was a young child when his mother shot and killed Senator Brown. And he was selling newspapers in Salt Lake City and had to run about the city shouting the news about his mother and how she had slain her lover. He wrote a letter to his mother in jail that read, "Dear Mama, I have saved $24 and put it in the bank. I will send it to you to help pay your lawyer when your trial begins. Your loving son, Matthew." According to that article, Anne had always actually favored Arthur's children over the children she had with her husband. And on top of that, Arthur's children received $12,000 from their father's estate to go towards their education. Meanwhile, the children from Anne's marriage, Matthew and his other sibling had to work very hard for everything they ever needed and wanted. And this weighed heavily on Matthew's mind over the years. He went to work at a mining company when he was 20 years old. And one day, Matthew received a visit from his half-brother, Arthur, and they had an argument over some trivial matter. And all the hatred that Matthew had kept tucked away for years finally came out, and he shot his half-brother and killed him. So I can only imagine Anne having to visit the grave of a child of the love of her life, which she killed, while visiting another child in jail who was responsible for his death. I can imagine also that her spirit might be restless due to these tragic events. And whether or not she actually walks the streets of Yellow Springs with Mr. Brown, I don't know, but it does make for a good ghost story. So those are our stories for today. We hope you enjoyed them. We will be doing another one on Friday, which is going to focus on another murder in Greene County. So you are welcome to join us for that as well. That is available on our website. It's the same type of program, and it's all through Zoom again. If you want to learn anything else about what we do here or any of our you know, if we have a website, so you know what kind of records we hold, what we do. We do a weekly blog post that covers a lot of these stories. We actually did a blog post on each one of these stories last year. This was our program from last year, actually, that I did for you today. We also are very active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We do a lot of our programmings. We try to record them and put them up on YouTube. So that's an option if you are interested in seeing any of our other programming. And we post to Instagram pretty much daily, and you can see a lot of our records on Flickr as well. So hope you guys enjoyed the program. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you. It was good.
Oh, thank you. Anyone else have any questions or comments? If you do and you want to send me a private message, you can do that as well. I did provide my email address there. If you want to learn about any of our records or what else we might do here, please feel free to reach out. Well, if nobody has any questions, then I want to say thank you again for joining us today. And I hope that we can do this again sometime. So keep us in mind for future events.
Thank you.
Thank you.